Today we're going to start in on policy, and the most basic sort of policy that we'll talk about in this course is policies to deal with externalities, and many other things are going to build upon that. And we'll start by talking about what exactly an externality is. Then we'll discuss Pigou's principle of payments in accordance with product. We'll talk about the notion that an externality is a missing price rather than an effect across people, and to emphasize that, we'll talk about the difference between pecuniary externalities or pure economic damages and real externalities, as well as internalities in other difficult cases. We'll then talk about how policy should respond to externalities, and three principal responses: Pigouvian taxation, the legal system as an implementation of damages, and the system of cap and trade or quantity restrictions. And we'll compare the price type restrictions, Pigouvian system, to the cap and trade, and talk about when each is attractive. We'll then talk about the notion of Stigler's Coase theorem and the informational problems with it, when the private sector can and cannot solve externality problems on their own. And in particular, the notion that information is really the core of externality problems. Okay. So today's lecture is about externalities, and we'll start by asking what an externality is. So what's the standard intuitive answer, Arvid, of what a externality is?
An externality is something that which imposes a cost upon another.
Yeah.
There's like two distinctions with what actually the price and one.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, but the standard thing is anytime my action affects another person. We'll see that this is really the wrong notion of an externality. Arvid, do you want to give the other thing you're about to say about what's really the more subtle notion of what an externality is?
Yeah, so there's like the one, like if you buy it, like if you have so many huge increase in demand, increasing price, you're making other worse off, but this is just through the allocation and scarcity.
Yeah.
Whereas the other is like if you pollute, it's upon others, but it's not encompassed by the actual price mechanism.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's really an effect that isn't taken into account in the price system. So let me give the most classic example. Imagine that an individual smoking affects n other individuals. The classic example is smoking. So imagine there are n individuals, and each individual J has a utility Uj from the amount they smoke and the amount that everybody else on average smokes, plus income that they have. So the total amount of smoking, S bar, the average amount of smoking, S bar, is just the average of the amount smoked by individuals. And then we add to that the total income of that person, J. And Matt, why do we make that quasi-linear in this expression?
Because it's not getting richer or having smoke.
It doesn't have a significant impact on his income, right? It's not the costs or benefits to him of smoking are not a significant part of his income, right? And we're able to then measure the benefit or cost to him of smoking in units of his income, right? Which is what we talked about in office hours yesterday, right? So if each individual chooses how many cigarettes to smoke, they'll set their marginal utility from smoking equal to 0. But wealth maximization also requires taking into account the effect that this has on the average level of smoking and therefore on everybody else. And so this requires that that your marginal utility from smoking plus the marginal utility, the amount that this affects the utility of other people, be set equal to 0. Because we can always redistribute income, and therefore the key thing is to take into account the average externality that you impose on other people. And this is Pigue's principle of payments in accordance with product. People must pay the average externality associated with their action. And this is not just economics, it's common sense. You should have to pay for any harm that you're causing to other people. And markets make you do this. Externality policy tries to address cases where markets are missing. And the only way to ensure that you generally have the right incentive. And the solution, this is the only way to in general ensure you have the right incentive, and your problem sets are going to have you look more at this. And the key thing is that the solution to the externality problem should focus on the absence of a relevant price rather than adjusting things that might have some relationship to that, but an indirect one. So for example, often people say if people in the economy aren't spending enough, we should have some fiscal policy that gives money out to people so they spend more. Well, that's not directly addressing what we think the problem is. What the problem is directly is that people aren't spending enough. So maybe rather than just giving them money, we should give them money if they spend money. So we should lower consumption taxes rather than just lower their taxes overall. Right? So that's how a Pigouvian would think about that problem. If there's not enough of something happening, we try to, as directly as possible, give people an incentive to do more of that thing. Right? Okay. Now, I think that most of the areas that we call externalities, I'll go through a bunch of distinguishing what's an externality and what's not. But I think that the key thing, as we'll come back to at the end of the lecture, about what makes something likely to be subject to externalities rather than to be easily addressed by markets, is when the harm that you do affects a large number of other people. If I consume one more donut, that takes one donut away from one other person who could have had that individual donut, right? And that's an easy thing for a market to deal with. But if my smoking affects 100 other people, we need to figure out what each of those people would have been willing to pay to have me not smoke. So it's when my benefit creates a public harm that affects many other people that it's very hard to internalize that externality. And we'll go through the informational reasons why that's true later in the lecture. Yeah, Donnie?
Would that be the case if you kill someone? Then?
No, I think killing is actually something that's much easier to address using just payments. And in fact, for a long time, and in many societies, people used blood money, where you would pay off for a murder that you'd committed. Now, if you don't have enough money, as the value of life has gotten greater and people have not had enough money to pay that off, we've been forced to put people in jail. But I don't really think of that as being an like one of these externality problems that's diffuse. That's something that I think is much easier for a market to deal with, actually, because it's affecting one other person primarily. Except, there might be spillovers to their family or whatever, but for the most part, it's affecting one other person. Okay, so Pigue's principle of payments in accordance with product is powerful because it gives the right incentives, but it can be problematic when people face risks. So for example, imagine that you had to pay all the harm that was caused by your car, period, because you're in control of your car. If you had a terrible, complete accident and you killed someone else, the only way you could really compensate for that would be to pay with your life, right? Even though it's a total accident. And that seems crazy, right? Eye for an eye justice really only seems appropriate when the person is in control of the consequences of their action. They don't face too much risk. So in order to give the right incentive, we have to force people to bear a ton of risk, and there's a trade-off between people facing incentives and bearing risk. And that's why we have all sorts of insurance, like car insurance. And once we have car insurance, then people aren't bearing the full cost of their actions, so we have to have more regulations on things that are indirectly causing harm to other people, like you going too fast or you running a red light. And that's why we have traffic regulations. Another problem that's like this is limited liability or judgment proofness. So you may not have enough money to pay for all the consequences of your action. And this is certainly true when your car kills someone. And this makes it impossible for you to pay in accordance with the product of your actions. And so other procedures become necessary to stop misbehavior. And we'll show that similar issues are going to show up all over economics. Okay. But first, I want to try to think about what things that affect other people might or might not really be externalities. So imagine I discover a giant hoard of gold, and as a result, the price of gold fall, and other people who own gold are worse off. So Franklin, where's Franklin? I thought I saw him earlier. No? Franklin's not here? Okay. Anybody else want to say whether this is an externality or not? Your name's Robert, right? Yeah, Robert.
So I think that it's an externality, but it's not the whole story because it benefits people who want to buy gold, so the externalities kind of balance out the price system. Yeah,
that's right. So that's called a pecuniary externality, and it's mediated through the price system. And so it's not really we're going to argue that it's not really an externality. We're going to argue that pecuniary externalities like that shouldn't be considered externalities. And that really what an externality means is not something that affects other people, but something that's not mediated through the price system. Because anytime something's mediated through the price system, someone is harmed, but there's someone who benefits an equal amount on the opposite side of the transaction. And this is probably the most common misapplication of the theory of externalities. So for example, if a new firm comes in to compete and this drives down prices, this is not an externality because the consumers benefit as much as the firms are harmed, even though it might seem to harm the firms, right? But Tyler, do you think it would be an externality if a firm came in, competed, didn't lower the price, but did take some of the business away from a firm that was currently making profits off that business? Could that be an externality?
So it's just, it could be the same price?
Yeah, imagine that they come in, they compete at the same price that the old firm has, but they take away some of their business on which that other firm was making profits. Would that be an externality?
I want to say no. But if they're, wouldn't the price have to lower if there's no supply from both of them?
Not necessarily. I mean, imagine it only lowers like a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, and that
Assuming they're small compared to everybody?
Well, no. It's just they just take some of the business. Like, they come into the industry, they supply half of the business, but they don't lower the price
Well,
much.
it could be like a more convenient location.
But imagine that it's not. Imagine that it's the same.
I still want to say it's not an externality, but I just can't give a better reason.
No, so it actually is an externality in that case, because there's no offsetting benefit to the consumers that compensates for that. They take away the profits from the firm loses, the consumers don't benefit. So in that case, that's an externality. Yeah, Connor.
But doesn't that new firm gain those profits?
Well, it does, but externalities are things where the effects that I have on others don't balance out. So when I got the gold, I obviously benefited from getting the gold, and then other people who owned gold were hurt. Other people who want to buy gold were benefited. But all the effects on people other than me balanced out. Here, that's not true. There's harms on the person who currently... In other words, it's basically the same as if I were to burn down someone's business and they were to lose some profits, and then I were to gain from that just because I felt good, right? Yeah, Albert.
Is it known as rent seeking, or is it related to rent seeking?
No, this is called business stealing, usually. So free trade with China could cause steel workers to lose their jobs, but this really just means that it's lowering the price of labor, right? And so it hurts the steel workers, but it benefits the people who might eventually end up hiring them next. Polluting a lake could kill the fish in the lake and therefore harm people who want to buy fish. Would that be a real externality? Well, no, because it will also benefit the people who sell competing fish. So the question is, who is really harmed by the real externality of polluting the lake? Anyone want to take a guess at that? Yeah, Vidur.
The fish.
But no, the people who use the lake for other activities.
Or the people who own the fish. right? Somebody has to own those fish, and if nobody owns the fish, well, then the person who effectively owns the fish is the person who, in whatever way, benefits from the fish's existence, right? So, like, it could be the fishers on that lake. So they would be the ones who would be harmed. Or imagine that a brilliant roommate gets stoned, and this causes you to beat the curve on a test, right? Well, that you could say has a positive externality on you, but it has a negative externality on everybody else who wasn't in your class, because now the average quality of students coming out of the school is lower for a given grade, because there is basically, so that again has an offsetting thing. Another example is selective abortion of women, which is very common in a lot of Asian countries, actually makes other women in that country better off because they're able to get better men. But on the other side of that market, the men are able to get less good women, and so that's a pecuniary externality in the marriage market. Yeah, Kevin.
So when you're referring to an externality, are you referring to like the externality on a certain person or group of people as opposed to like the entire action itself? So for example, with the lake example?
Well, I think the most grammatically correct thing would be to say that your action creates an externality if the net effects on other people are balanced. And that you shouldn't really talk about who the externality accrues to. But in our legal system, you usually pay to someone if and only if your action creates an uncompensated externality where they bear the costs and no one gets a benefit. And so we often do say an externality accrues to someone, even though in some sense that's a little bit inaccurate. Because in principle, you could take an action which benefits some people, harms other people, but on net causes more harm than benefit to other people, and that action would create an externality, even though a large chunk of that externality would be purely pecuniary and would cancel out, and only the residual would be aggregate externality. And in fact, we'll talk about that a lot later when we talk about more stuff about externalities. So, okay, so this distinction shows up quite a bit in the law. So in the law, there's a notion of pure physical damages, such as you hit a doctor with your car, or you burn down someone's house. That's a physical damage to those people. Or you defame someone's character with libel. These are direct, if not exactly physical, harms. On the other hand, there's something called pure economic losses, such as you might have hurt the patients of that doctor by killing the doctor, because now they no longer have their doctor. That's considered a pure economic loss because the other doctors in the community will offsettingly benefit in exchange for that doctor dying. Or if your house value, if when you've burned down your house, the value of other people's houses in the neighborhood rises because there's less housing stock available, that would be purely pecuniary because it's, or purely economic benefit to those other people, not a physical benefit. However, suppose that your house was really beautiful, and so when your house gets burned down, actually all of the houses of the other houses in the neighborhood fall, because now there's this ugly burnt out lot rather than a beautiful house in the neighborhood. Franklin, would that be a real physical damage or a pure economic loss to the other people in the neighborhood?
The house burning down?
The effect of the house burning down, which is that actually the other prices in the neighborhood fall because they no longer have the beautiful house around to make their houses more attractive places to live.
I guess it's just physical, right? Because
Why?
it's just affecting the prices of these other houses. And
But we just said that it wouldn't have been that it would have been a pure economic loss if the price had gone up because there was less competition for housing in that neighborhood. But you're now saying that it would be a physical damage if it caused the prices to go down because because they no longer had the beautiful house to keep them as attractive. What do you think?
I mean, I'm viewing this as sort of just it's sort of the same effect as if like a meteorite like hits all these other houses, right?
Yeah, that's basically right. So like the key thing is there was no price that was being paid to the owner of the original house for the benefits that he was giving to all the houses in the neighborhood. As a result of that, the loss to the other houses wasn't mediated through the price system. And if the guy was being paid for all those benefits he was bringing, then all the real losses would accrue to the person whose house was destroyed. But because they weren't paying for those benefits they were getting, some of the benefits also accrued some of the benefits were accruing to other people in the neighborhood, and therefore destroying the house causes some losses to the other people in the neighborhood. And the fall in the price of the house isn't benefiting the potential buyers, because the potential buyers don't find it as attractive to come into the neighborhood. So effectively, the price for them has fallen, but it hasn't really fallen once you take into account the reduced value of the house. So pure economic losses are indirect and mediated through the price system, and they're basically the same thing as pecuniary externalities. So in the law, the distinction between physical and pure economic losses is really the same as the distinction in economics between externalities and and pecuniary externalities. Okay, so this was a major issue during the Deepwater Horizon, trying to distinguish who, harmed by the Deepwater Horizon, was really the victim of a real externality and who was just the victim of a pecuniary externality. So what about, Jack, what do you think of the harm to shrimping employees who lost their job as a result of the Deepwater Horizon? Should they be compensated?
I think the leak just represents a change in demand for labor. Their market has changed, so there's less demand for shrimpers in that area.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of other things we could have done to reduce the demand for shrimp. Like anytime a consumer stopped buying shrimp, then they would have to pay damages if we were to admit that principle, right? Yeah. How about the government conservation agency, who's sort of entrusted with the responsibility of looking out for the birds in that area? Peter is no longer in this class. Anyone else want to answer that? Yeah, Donnie.
It seems like that's a direct physical.
Yep.
So it would be
Why?
compensation.
Why do you say it's direct physical damage?
Well, if you pour oil on something and someone is tasked with protecting, then you've directly harmed them.
Yeah, so that person is basically, that government agency you can think of as the trust for all the public's valuation for the birds, right? And so they have to be, their responsibility is to preserve those birds, and so you've sort of directly harmed the thing which they own. How about the Louisiana hotel industry serving people who come to work on shrimping in that area? Vidur, what do you think about that?
So that does lead to a decrease in the demand, simply because there's less demand for shrimp labor in the area. So I guess that's a pure economic one.
Yeah, so basically it will benefit anyone who wants to come vacation in that area as much as it will harm the hotel industry, right? How about disrupted shippers through the port of New Orleans? Moonsu, what do you think about that? The shippers who used to ship out of the port of New Orleans, are they the victim of pure economic losses or physical damage?
I would say pure economic.
Why?
Because there would be other shippers with benefit.
Anybody else? So they're no longer able to ship as efficiently. That's more costly to them. Who else gets an offsetting benefit from that? So basically, if the port charged the full value to people of shipping their goods out of the port, then all that would happen when the port gets polluted is the price of the port would go down, right? And then the shippers wouldn't be worse off because the price would come down to compensate them, right? Because the port usually does not charge that full value to people, then it is harmful that there was the pollution there. Because effectively, it's taking away something they weren't paying for, and therefore it creates a physical externality on them. Yeah, Kevin.
So with the hotel examples, if you were to consider the, I guess, scenery of the beach or something like that, similar to the house example from before, would that change it from being economic to physical?
Yeah, I mean, if the housing people, okay, if there was a price for going onto the beach or a price for viewing the scenery, then no.
Right.
But if there weren't, then yes. Yes, that's right. So you see, it's very important to like think about what things there are or not market prices for to disentangle these. Okay. Now, so what we just argued was that not everything across people is a real externality. But now I want to argue that not everything within people is just fine and dandy. For example, individuals often neglect the effect of their actions on their future self. Everyone's comfortable with the idea of me having an externality on you who are sitting next to me. But we're not okay with the idea of me having an externality on myself in 10 years. But if you think about it, you sitting next to me are a lot closer to me in a lot of ways, and I know you a lot better and feel more connected to you than I do to myself in 10 years. And in the same way, there can be a failure of the Lagrange multipliers within yourself to fully take into account your effect on the welfare of yourself in 10 years. The same way that a price can fail to take into account the effect on other people. So there are some important areas of policy that are to a large extent governed by concerns about what are called internalities. Tyler, what are some examples of those?
Example of policy.
Yeah, what are policy areas where you think that the interventions that are taken are largely driven by concerns about internalities rather than externalities?
I'm thinking like warnings on smoking cigarettes and alcohol and things like that. So long-term health issues, they are advised against or regulated in some sense, high taxes and that on cigarettes and stuff like that.
Yeah, that cigarettes are a really good example. Addiction and drugs. Many people believe addicts would be better off themselves quitting. And this justifies sin taxes and prohibitions and so forth. Forced savings and Social Security is another example, because people are afraid that people will be tempted not to save. Energy efficiency standards or CAFE standards, those are standards mandating that cars have a certain amount of fuel economy, are another example. So in a forthcoming paper, Alcott and Wozni showed that consumers don't respond to energy costs as much as you'd think that they should, and therefore efficiency mandates can be better for consumers, at least to some extent, and that this effect is actually much larger than any pollution that's given off by the car. And that's actually the main motivation behind CAFE standards, is this consumer's failure to fully take into account oil prices, not the externalities created by the cars. Another example of this is suicide or organ donation, prohibition on markets like prostitution. A lot of those are driven by concerns about internalities. So here's the example from Alcott and Wozni. So what they basically look at is how much does the effective value of different cars change when the oil price changes. And they do that based on forecasting, how much oil you would end up using in the car. And as a result, you should see a certain amount of reaction and demand. And the reaction that you should see is up here, but the reaction you actually see is down here, which basically says that people don't respond, the reaction you should see if people were rational is the red, and that you do see is the blue. And as a result, it says that people don't fully respond to the change in oil prices, and therefore they might benefit from being sort of forced to take oil prices more into account. Yeah, Kevin.
So how do they know, I guess in like all of those examples, that you couldn't just consider that with like maybe a smaller discount factor in utility function instead of like, so what?
Well, because people seem to be time inconsistent. They seem to when they're planning ahead, they act as if they're more patient than when they're like making the decision right now. And so that seems inconsistent and motivates these types of interventions. Okay, so another difficult case for externalities is imagine that the net externality to all people currently alive of you having a child is $0. And the child that you bring into the world will have a happy, fulfilling life, right? The question is there any externality to be corrected here of you having a child? Franklin, what do you think?
Sorry, spaced out.
So imagine the externality to everyone currently living and everyone who will live, other than this child, of you having a child is on net 0. And imagine that the child will have a good, happy life if you bring him into the world, her or him into the world. Do you is there an externality to be corrected with regard to you having that child or not?
I mean, it's just a child's life, right? So not sure that there is, but.
So, do you think you might have an externality on the child from bringing them into the world?
Or not bringing them into the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. In fact, this is one of the hardest problems in utilitarian philosophy. It's called the happy child problem. And there's a huge amount of stuff written about it. So I don't know what to say about it. I think it's probably probably the hardest problem in utilitarian moral philosophy. So I'm not surprised you don't have a good answer to it. So another question is, imagine that you're driving drunk on the road. So you get drunk and you go driving. Do you have an externality on other cars on the road? To other people driving in the same car with you? What do you think? Is Saad here? No? Anybody else want to say whether they think you have an externality to other people driving in the car with you, who chose to drive in the car with you? Connor, what do you think?
Well, if you don't tell them that you're drunk, obviously you do. But even if you do, you could still maybe argue that you still do impose an externality on them because they shouldn't have gotten with the car. They should have gotten in the car with you, even though they agreed to. So it was irrational for them.
Well, but imagine that they completely rationally got into the car with you.
But you could just say getting in the car with you is irrational.
No, but let's just imagine that it's not irrational. That you completely rationally got into the car with you. Could you still have an externality on them? What do you think, Robert?
It's it goes back to the risk aversion thing. That there is a small chance that you'll get in an accident and they'll die, and that they think that the chance of that times the severity of that is worth the ride home, and it could still technically be rational if it's seen as such a tiny chance.
I think you guys are missing a key part. Yeah, Lancelot?
Although if you're drunk, it depends on if you agree with them before the party on whether they were going to drink or not. Because if they didn't know you were going to drink and you just tell them when you open your car, oh yes, I'm drunk, you're actually not giving them the option to keep it safe, right? You take an option away from them. So
I think you're getting a little bit closer. Yeah, Miles?
I don't think there's any externality at all, because at the point where they enter the market willingly going into your car, the price is effectively set at 0 for them to enter. So you could, maybe the more drunk you get and you still want them to come with you, maybe you pay the money. But given that can be reflected in prices by them leaving the market, I don't see an actual externality there.
Well, let's try another example. Is there an externality to other people who are on the road, Robert, when you drive drunk?
Yeah, well, I would say there is, because like, they have no idea, so it wouldn't be reflected in any implicit or explicit.
What if everybody knows that there's someone out there driving drunk on the road? And they still choose to they chose to get on the road. Voluntarily. Nobody forced them to get on the road. They could have stayed off of the road. Why is that an externality on them?
Because it's still your benefit and you're harming them.
Exactly. And that's the same in the previous example, right? So it has nothing to do with whether they voluntarily chose to expose themselves to that externality or not. The question is whether in your decision making you took into account the harms that you had on them. So the relevant question is, if they're friends of yours who, because you drove drunk, are going to hold that against you and sort of reduce the value that you get from them as friends in the future, then there's no externality. And that's harder for people on the road to do for you than for your friends to do, and that's the only reason it would or would not be an externality. It's all about whether you internalize in your decision making the costs that you impose on the other people, and not at all to do with whether those people voluntarily chose to expose themselves to the externality or not. Yeah, Luke?
Doesn't this also kind of get into the duty thing? Like, you can't impose an externality on your friends if they were otherwise not expecting a ride from you. It's only an externality if they think that they were going to get a ride from you, and then all of a sudden, because you chose to drink instead of giving them a ride sober, you're imposing this negative cost.
Well, but I mean, you could still be imposing a positive externality on them by choosing not to get drunk and to offer them the ride.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's a question of where the baseline is. Is the baseline you give them a sober ride, or is the baseline you give them no ride at all?
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, hey, if you want, I'm drunk, let's go.
Yeah.
Then it's positive because...
Yeah. But still, even if they didn't know it, still, if you were sort of... If your plan had otherwise been to be sober and give them a ride, even if they didn't know it, could have been a negative externality that you got drunk because you took away that positive externality.
Sure, so it depends on what the baseline
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, that's all.
Then there also like an issue about like who is imposing an externality on who. So if I drunk drive, I might be imposing an externality on other drivers on the road. But there is also like the other perspective that is that other people driving on the road increases my risk to hit him. And so he's actually like imposing an externality.
No, but only if you're forced to pay for the fact that you have an accident with him. If you're not forced to pay for that, then he's not imposing an externality on you because you're not paying anyway for the fact that you hit him.
Yeah, because our insurance is
Yeah. So, yeah, Zafran.
Yeah, do you assume you can still make rational decisions when you're drunk?
Well, that's the next point. So, is there can there be an internality to yourself, Albert? What do you think?
I think it's, yeah. Some you misjudge how much you harm yourself in the future. Like when you're drunk.
Yeah. Yeah, so getting that might impose an internality on yourself because you fail to take into account the utility of your future self. How about an externality on your family or those who depend on you? Anyone want to venture a guess on that? Yeah, Donnie.
Just on the basis of the first question, it seems like it's pretty similar, right? You're imposing a cost on them, you would otherwise give them the benefit.
But the question is whether you internalize their...
Jerk, right? Maybe it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But if the baseline is that you're not...
Well, the question is whether you internalize the cost that you're imposing on them, which depends on whether they sort of like give you hell for the fact that they learned that you were drunk driving home and it risked yourself and so forth, right? Is there an externality on a future child that you might potentially have but now cannot have as a result of having gotten drunk and maybe hurt yourself? What do you think, Miles?
Given that you're probably not going to take into account the fact that a child that now you might not be able to have isn't able to give you crap because they're never going to be alive now.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any way you can internalize that.
Well, but it depends a lot on what your answer to the happy child problem was. So whether we should internalize that stuff at all anyway, right? And I think if we do think there is a problem on your child, how is your future child really all that different from your future self? Because you're also, if you fail to really think about the fact that you're bringing... So anyways, there's all these things, right? So The real question is, how much do you internalize the utility of the relevant individual relative to what we think you should be internalizing them, right? Similarly, you could think, is reckless sex an externality on your responsible future self, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of difficult, interesting philosophical issues that come up in these things of externalities. But let's hold that all fixed and bracket it all now and think about how we actually respond to externalities with policy once we've decided what they are. So if there's an external harm from an action, we should tax it. And if there's an external benefit, we should subsidize it. This is really the simplest solution because it directly creates a price for the activity. And the tax must be equal to the marginal externality at the optimal level of the action, because otherwise it fails to play the same role of as price. And some cases, however, just having a constant tax that's at the level of the externality may be insufficient to get the optimal action taken. Tyler, why might that be the case?
Does it have to do with the elasticity of the demand for whatever it is?
No, so anything with a standard elasticity, if you impose the right tax, will go to the right place.
Right, yeah.
But there's other situations that could be a little bit different.
I don't know if this is the right time to this applies here, but like the difference between this and cap and trade has to do with whether or not I still think it has to do with, I don't know, I still think it has to do with the elasticity of demand. Because like for example, like like if you were to cap and trade I don't think I can.
Well, here's a simple situation. Imagine you have a platform like Facebook, and the firm's value depends on the users, right, that it has. The more people that use the service, the more valuable they are. And that type of service can take a long time to take off, because unless everyone thinks that everyone else is going to use it, no one uses it. Now, it may be optimal to subsidize Facebook as a result at the optimal equilibrium by a small amount, for the amount that having one more person causes Facebook to be better by a small amount, right? But that might not be enough to get Facebook launched. Because in order to get it to the optimal point, everyone needs to coordinate on using it. And the small subsidy that you offer at equilibrium might not be enough to catalyze that. So you might have to offer a much bigger subsidy early on to get people to use Facebook, and then only later move it up to the equilibrium level. So if you have these coordination effects where the demand curve can actually slope the wrong way, right, where you can be willing to pay more if there are more people using it, then you might need to subsidize even more early on in order to get to the optimal point. And that's a more general thing, is if there are like big coordination effects in the consumption of a good, then you might need to not just impose the optimal subsidy at the optimum, but actually impose something that helps coordinate people on that optimum. This strategy is called an insulating tariff, and I wrote a paper about it. Okay, so the most common application of the idea of a Pigouvian subsidy or tax is taxes on pollution. So one example of this was proposed by Lawrence White. It was called an effluent tax, and the idea is that every time your car got inspected, rather than forcing you to have carburetors or forcing you to have other stuff, you would just pay a tax for however much emissions you were giving out. And the idea is that then different cities could choose how costly pollution was there. In the middle of Arizona, pollution is not that costly. In a big city, it is very costly. And so you could charge different effluent taxes, and people could respond in terms of what clean things they got on their car. In France, the government assesses pollution taxes based on little monitors of the smokestacks of different factories. where it measures all the things coming out of the factory and charges taxes based on each of those. A carbon tax is another thing like this, which we'll talk much more about on Tuesday, but this is used in Europe. Now, most economists prefer this sort of tax over direct regulation. Is Samuel Pearl here? No. Anyone else want to describe why most economists feel that way? Yeah, Franklin.
Well, different polluters have different marginal benefits from polluting, and so
Yeah.
this would allow them to use prices to change their practices.
Yeah, that's right. So regulation can be more costly if you don't target it at the people who are the cheapest to do it. Regulation is not targeted directly. Remember we said Pigou's principle is to target it directly at the issue as much as possible. It's not actually the particular sources of pollution, but the pollution overall that causes the problem. And therefore we should tax it as uniformly as possible to try to get people to, in this cheapest way, conserve on the pollution, right? So for example, Margaret Fowley and her co-authors show that currently there's very strong regulation of the emission of nitrous oxide from fixed source plants. But there's very little of cars. And that if you had cars reduce their amount of NOx and plants increase their amount of NOx, you could get a major gain. So this shows this is how the cost of installing a NOx reduction technology in cars. And here is the distribution of abatement costs in factories. And currently, things are over here. But you could gain a benefit of this area if instead all the cars did the abatement and these factories got to pollute. And that you could get by having a carbon tax rather than restrictions on these factories. Okay. So in the US, many, if not most, Pigouvian taxes are collected through the legal system. So when an individual or firm causes harm, they get sued, and the court assesses how much harm was caused. And the individual causing the harm must pay compensatory damages that are directly redress for the harms that they caused, as well as sometimes punitive damages. And these deal with the fact that you don't always perfectly detect someone committing a crime. So imagine that someone does something that harms people, but only 1 out of 3 times you can figure out that it was them. Then you should charge people 3 times the harm that they actually caused, so 2 times the real harm in punitive damages, just because there was only a 1 in 3 chance you caught them. This can also deal with the fact that the plaintiff, the person bringing the claim for the harm, might have an incentive to actually put themselves in harm's way in order to get more damages if they got fully compensated. So you might want some of those damages not to go to the plaintiff, but to go to the government. Okay. So the Anglo-Saxon legal system, which is filled with lawsuits, everyone says US is so litigious, right? There's just constant lawsuits, is incorporating Pigou's principles, because not everything can be covered in statutes. And in fact, the reason why the US is so litigious, and everyone always complains about them, they say Europe is so much better, it has so many fewer lawsuits. But that's because Europe has many more regulations. Because when you don't directly incorporate the externalities, what you have to do is regulate behavior more specifically, right? Now, most of these externalities are actually paid by negotiations or settlements rather than actually by going to court. Whereas in Europe, there's much more direct control of behavior. But there's really a spectrum between these two things, because liability that people pay is almost never just for the consequences of their action. It's rarely for like anything that goes wrong in something you were involved in. Instead, standards of negligence are used, where you were supposed to have done certain things that are considered reasonable things to have done in the circumstance, and if you do less than this, you have to pay for the consequences. So in effect, that's some sort of direct mandate on behavior combined with payment for the consequences of your actions. Because otherwise we would have so many lawsuits and too much risk that people could face if anything they were involved in might have caused a harm. So if a very famous example of this was that there was someone on a train who was helping a woman onto the train. And as she was helping her onto the train, he dropped a box that she was holding. And the box that she was holding turned out to have firecrackers in it. And the firecrackers spilled out, exploded, destroying the whole station and like killing tons of people. So you couldn't really hold that guy responsible for what he did, because there's no reasonable way he could have known that the box was full of firecrackers, and therefore that he shouldn't have done that. Yeah, Vidur.
Did he survive?
Apparently he did, yeah. He was like maimed, but he survived. Okay, so another classic example is medical malpractice. Doctors are required to take due care, but they don't have to like pay for all the consequences that accrue to their patients, right? Otherwise, it would be a huge source of risk for doctors. And even with malpractice, private insurance helps address these problems a little bit and actually reduce the amount that's borne by the doctor themselves. Okay. So instead of having a tax, you can actually mandate the quantity of the activity that is allowed. And then allow people to trade the right to do those activities, right? So you can put a maximum amount on pollution and then auction the rights to pollute. Or if it's a positive externality, you can say that there's a minimum amount that has to occur, and that if you don't do something, you have to pay for the right not to do it, right? And then you can allow people to trade, say, the right to pollute. The most efficient mitigators will sell their permits to the least efficient. And if the quantity that's allowed is set at the efficient level, then the price must be the same as the tax at the margin, right? And this is basically equivalent for all intents and purposes. This is particularly obvious with an auction, right? Imagine if you set a certain number of permits and then you hold an auction for the right to pollute. The price at that auction will be equal to the optimal equilibrium price, right? Now, in practice, one of the reasons why the cap and trade system is more popular than is the Pigouvian tax is that it's not as clear that you're raising all this revenue from it, that you could raise all this revenue via an auction. And therefore, you can give the permits back to people who are your political supporters as a way to pay them off to get them to support the legislation. So, whereas, with taxes, this would look like you're just blatantly handing out money to people. With cap and trade, it's a little bit more hidden, the fact that you're blatantly handing out money to people, right? But putting aside these politics, let's try to think about whether there's an economic logic favoring cap and trade versus Pigouvian taxes. And the real question there is whether we lock in a certain quantity of the activity or whether we lock in a particular price of the activity. Imagine that we don't know how much value the private sector will get from doing this activity. The problem is that policy gets set before we know that, and policy can very easily be inflexible. And so let's consider a simple example of this. Imagine that the marginal private value to the private sector of doing an activity is equal to P star minus A times Q minus Q star minus epsilon. That's basically like a downward sloping demand curve, but it has this shifter epsilon that can move around how valuable it is to the private sector to do this activity. And imagine the marginal social cost is P star times B plus B times Q minus Q star. So again, this is like an upward sloping supply curve. The more of this activity that's done, the more costly it is. The social optimum would be to set Q star star equal to Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon. You want to respond to what the private sector wants to do, but not as much as the private sector would want to respond to it, because it's going to be increasingly costly the more of it that's done. So the Harberger triangle of deadweight loss that's caused by not implementing the optimum, let me just draw this thing out. Actually, I think I have a graph on the next slides. Yeah, I'll show you the graph. So the Harburger triangle is equal to the difference between how much is actually implemented and the socially optimal amount squared, right? Multiplied by some things. So this is quadratic loss, and what that means is we want to try to get things as close as possible to the socially optimal amount. Now, if we impose a price, the optimal price to put on this market is to just internalize the social cost as well as we're able to estimate it. And if you solve out for the equilibrium here, Q is going to, on average, be equal to Q star. So what that means is we should set the price equal to P star. Now, we don't know what epsilon is going to be. If we knew what epsilon was going to be, we could put the optimal price. But we don't know that, so we're just forced to put price P star. In that case, the amount that ends up being created is Q equals Q star plus epsilon. So that responds too much to the change in epsilon relative to what would be socially optimal. On the other hand, if we just mandate the quantity to be Q star, then it's just going to be fixed and equal to Q star the whole time. And the question is, which is closer, the quantity control or the price control to what we actually socially optimally want to implement? Is K Yao Pan here? No? Anyone else want to guess about that? Yeah, Connor.
Well, it depends on whether A is less than B.
Yeah, exactly. So if A is less than B, what happens, Connor?
So if A is less than B, then that would mean that the elasticity of the social cost, or the private cost. So if A is less than B, then that means that it's better to do a quantity tax.
Yeah. And the way you can just see that mathematically here is that you want to have less than 1/2 responsiveness to epsilon, and so that's closer to 0 responsiveness than it is to full responsiveness, and vice versa the other way, right? So let's try to go through the reasoning behind that. So that's the case in which the private value is in the case in which A is greater than B, the social value is more inelastic. It moves more quickly as the quantity changes, right? And the private value is relatively elastic. That means that if we even go a little bit above what like the social planner wants, suddenly the costs are getting really quickly. It would be a bad idea to put a price on there because we might misestimate the right price to get the right quantity, and we might end up like going over the cliff, right? On the other hand, if the private value is more inelastic and the social value is more elastic, then it would be much better to put the price on, because we don't want to stop some really high value uses that might arise if epsilon is great, or some really, encourage really low value uses if epsilon is small, right? And you can think about a lot of the types of policies we implement as a society in these terms. So for example, for local externalities, like things that only affect people in a local area, those don't accumulate across society. And that makes the social value highly elastic, right? It's not like if more of it is done, it's much more harmful, right? So like stuff like smoking, whatever, things that are local tend to be implemented through torts and through the legal system, which are like taxes, right? Or smoking is another example of this. That's something where some people find it incredibly costly to quit. And we don't want to impose those big costs on them, so we have a tax on it rather than putting a cap on the total amount of smoking. On the other hand, for congestion on roads, it usually makes sense not to put a tax on that, but to put a cap on the total number of people on a road, because usually roads are something where, like, if you get beyond a certain amount, they become total hell. And it hardly costs you to have cars up to that point. So it's much better to put a cap on the total number of cars than to have a tax, which might or might not be the right thing to clear the market. Similarly, lead in gasoline is another thing like this, where it's not like almost everyone has exactly the same cost of not using lead. It's basically just whatever the price is for reducing the lead. And that means that the mitigation of it is very flat, and therefore it's better to put just put a cap on it. But it's not like there's going to be many people who it's going to be cheaper to not use leaded gas, etc. Yeah, Donnie.
What would a flexible tax look like relative to these? Like a tax that varies?
So the optimal thing would always be to just impose exactly the marginal social cost. So you should have a tax which is exactly a function of the quantity in the way that the marginal social cost is. That would be the optimal thing. But if you can't do that and you have to have either a price or a quantity, basically here are the two situations. So here's the case where the private social value is really, really inelastic and the social cost is quite elastic. Then if we impose a quantity control, you see we get these big dead weight loss triangles relative to the social optimum if the demand moves around. Whereas if we impose a price control, we only get these small wedges. On the other hand, if the private demand is elastic and the social cost is inelastic, and we impose a quantity control, we only get this small deadweight loss. But if we impose a price control, we get these bigger triangles over here. Because basically, you want the control to look roughly like the marginal social cost curve looks like. So if it's inelastic, you want the control to be inelastic. So you want to sort of imitate the path along which the optimum moves as you move epsilon. Okay. So all of these are sort of public or government-led solutions, but some have suggested that such solutions are not necessary, and that you can just give property rights over the relevant things, and people always bargain to efficiency. So for example, if you make a lot of noise at night, and that keeps your neighbor up, the optimal thing might be for you to make a small amount of noise, which is just enough for you to enjoy yourself, and not so much that it bugs drives your neighbor crazy, right? If he has the right, if your neighbor has the right to make as much noise as he wants, well then he can come to you and say, why don't you pay me to make less noise, right? If you have the right to absolute quiet, well then you can come to him and say, well, why don't you pay me to allow you to make a little bit of noise, right? Either way, you'll reach basically the same bargain, and it will be an efficient one. So why is there any need for the government to intervene in this situation, right? Shouldn't all externality problems solve themselves this way, right? So this was Stigler's Coase theorem. And the reason it's called Stigler's Coase theorem rather than the Coase theorem is that that Coase didn't really believe in this exactly. He really meant it as a reductio ad absurdum on models where you had complete information, and therefore people were able to always bargain to efficiency. So what Stigler's Coase theorem says is, if there are no transaction costs of bargaining, then the efficient solution always results. And if income effects are small, that outcome will be independent of the assignment of property rights. But the real problem is, what is the transaction cost of bargaining, right? It's really anything that impedes you from achieving efficiency. So this is basically just a tautology. What it says is, if there's nothing to get in the way of efficiency, then things will be efficient, right? Another way of putting this is, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. The problem is we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. But the thing that is useful about the Coase theorem is it can be a useful guide in some cases to ways that people might be able to solve problems without intervention. So what are cases when we might think that bargaining will work well? Again, Samuel's not here, but anyone else want to say that? Yeah, Luke.
When the size of the transaction cost is small compared to the benefits of reaching an agreement.
Yeah, that might be a case, but they might not reach the perfect agreement if the transaction costs are high, even if the benefits of the agreement are high.
It's
right?
the relative cost versus benefits, right?
Yeah, so that'll help, but the question is, like, what are some things that make transaction costs high or low? Does anyone have thoughts of those? Vidar?
The information both parties have. So both parties know everything about what the other person is offering, and then you can actually come to an agreement.
Yeah. So also a small number of people. The more number of people there are, the more opportunities there are for there to be these informational problems, or even just problems finding people, right? And bargaining is often facilitated by a long-term relationship or by a merger between groups. Mike, this is running out of batteries, but it might be okay because I've only got 15 minutes. I don't know what you think. So like an example of that is condominium associations or company towns. Like here in Hyde Park, the University of Chicago tries to internalize a lot of externalities because they own so much of the land, they can control so much, they can monitor what's going on, etc. In cooperative firms, in the European Union, when there were a relatively small number of countries, it was much easier for them to bargain to efficiency, or in a small department, it's easier. As there get to be larger numbers of people, it becomes increasingly costly to do that coordination and to have the right information. But such mergers don't always work because, of course, there can be internalities as well within firms and organizations. And also, it's not always good for them to internalize the externalities, because if they internalize pecuniary externalities, that's actually harmful. Because a pecuniary externality on one side will harm people on the other side and create a real externality on the other people. So, for example, mergers by competing firms are basically internalizing of the pecuniary externalities that one firm has on the other by competing, which in fact is harmful, creates market power, and leads them to harm consumers, right? Or industry-wide lobbying groups can be like this as well. They can internalize the pecuniary externalities of them failing to lobby for something that's good for the industry but harms consumers. Another example of this would be like a pack of popular girls in high school. Remember we said that, like, reducing competition in the dating market can benefit the group that is collusive but harm the other side of the market. Similarly, like popular girls can sort of collude to make life hell for people on the other side of that dating market, right? So despite its potential benefits, the Coase theorem, I think, is mostly misleading. Is David Wilson here? No? Does anyone want to talk about why, especially Joe Farrell, thought the Coase theorem can be quite misleading about whether intervention is beneficial or not? Anyone read the Farrell piece? No. Jack worked for Joe Farrell at one point, so he should have read all of his papers. I think the most important reason that Farrell emphasizes is that Pigouvian taxation can really only help, because no matter what set of taxes you put on, you can always still bargain, right? All the taxation does is set a baseline so that in case people aren't able to bargain, they are at least starting at a good point, right? And in fact, there's a nice paper by Ilya Segal and Mike Winston which shows that you always get more efficient bargaining the closer the starting point is to the efficient point. And so, therefore, some partial property, imagine that the best thing is that that the noise is about halfway between what I want it to be and what you want it to be. Well, the best thing might actually be for each of us to have half of the property rights on it, because that will lead to under imperfect information, to us getting as close as possible to the right bargain. Second, many externalities are so diffuse that it's really hard to bargain, or even impossible. So, like, how could you get everyone on the Earth together? Imagine one person had the right to determine exactly what the climate was like. Could you really get everyone together on Earth to bargain over what the climate should be like, right? Most importantly, information is often diffuse on these issues. The consensus of experts is often much better on figuring out climate change than all the people would be bargaining in a decentralized way. So at best, bargaining is only as good as the information that the parties who are able to get to bargain have and are able to share with each other. So the real question you want to ask with externalities is, who knows best about this market failure, and how can we best get them to communicate and reveal that information? The Coase theorem says little, if anything, against intervention. It's really only a reminder that the formal interventions we give are not the end of the line, that people will continue to bargain even after we make those, right? So the real problem is how to obtain the right information. And this is going to be the theme of our next class. And the problem is that typically some information is diffused and some information is best organized by expertise. So for example, scientific and technical information is often better centralized, and a lot of the analysis of externalities follows these lines. Like they had the Stern review of climate change, there's benefit cost analysis, epidemiologists come up with views about how much externalities there are from people failing to get vaccines, and combining these things with economic analysis of costs and benefits, such as the value of human life inferred from market prices, can play a very important role in generating analyses of externalities. But some information is private, subjective, and personal information that's held by individuals and needs to be aggregated from them. And both of these types of things are cases where externalities will be really important, either because there's diffuse information or because there's some group of experts that knows the information but the two individuals bargaining don't. But the problem with the subjective information is it can be very hard to extract in many contexts. And there are some simple contingent valuation surveys that people run that work poorly because they're particularly sensitive to strategic considerations. So imagine we went around to everybody and we just asked them what their value of different externalities was. Like, how harmed are you by smoking? Well, people would have an incentive, if they don't want people to smoke, to say, oh, it's infinitely harmful to me, so that the government stops people from smoking. And if I do want to be able to smoke, I'd say it doesn't harm me at all, even if it does. So a famous example of this from The Economist magazine was that they went around Haiti, and they asked people, are you getting shipments of aid after the earthquake that are allowing you to live? And everyone said, no, we're not getting any shipments of aid. And then they went and looked, and they saw that they all had these UN boxes filled with food. So how could it possibly be the case that they weren't getting shipments of aid? And as they asked people, why did you lie to us? And they said, well, we thought that if you knew we were getting shipments of aid, no more aid would come, right? So if you're going around asking people, and that's going to affect policy, people will respond strategically in the way that most affects policy in the direction they want, not in the way that's necessarily most honest, right? But trying to institute incentive-compatible mechanisms can be difficult, and we'll be talking about this during the next class as well as towards the end of the course. Great, we're done a few minutes early.